today. Hugh had reached out and asked if we could give a bit of a presentation on some of the stuff that we're up to in Saskatchewan. So this talk will give you a little bit of a summary of where we've been and where we're planning on going here in Saskatchewan in terms of land cover mapping. So I did just want to mention that this project actually got started before I arrived at the Ministry of Environment, and it was led by a few folks in our ministry, specifically Ben Sawa and Beatrice Prieto. They took the bull by the horns and got some funding for this project from external sources, that being the Plains and Prairie Pothole Landscape Conservation Cooperative down in the States, and also secured some internal funding to do it. So we were a pretty small group when we started this project, but we had then established a bit of a pilot project steering committee just to help us out with the direction of this project, and that consisted of Saskatchewan Research Council, members of our Ministry of Agriculture, folks from our Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport, Environment and Climate Change Canada. Lyle Boychuk was also on this steering committee from Ducks Unlimited, some folks from Water Security Agency, our Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center, as well as individuals from Sask Polytechnic, who are also doing similar work in the province, and we also received some help from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada staff. So just to acknowledge some other folks that were heavily involved with getting this project up and off the ground. So to give folks a little bit of background, the Prairie Landscape Inventory project was started about 3 years ago, and the real goal or purpose behind it was evaluate some ways to update Saskatchewan's land cover in the agricultural region of the province. But really, we wanted a product that had the ability to distinguish native and tame grasslands. And I'll just sort of walk you through why that's important in the current landscape right now. At least in Saskatchewan, and other jurisdictions may be different. For example, I know that Alberta has their own land cover mapping products, but for Saskatchewan, and I suspect some other Canadian jurisdictions, there's a fairly extensive nationwide data sets that are available. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has some land cover mapping in 5-year intervals, as well as some yearly mapping products. And Saskatchewan also has a product called the Southern Digital Land Cover, or SDLC. And just to give folks a little bit of an overview, the Southern Digital Land Cover product in Saskatchewan was made using imagery from the mid-90s. It was produced in 1994. It's a 30-meter resolution product, so that just means the land covers are represented as 30-meter squares across the province. And there were 27 different land cover classes that were included in this classification. So you can see things like it did include an assessment of what they called native dominant grassland. It did include hay crops and pasture, which tended to fall more into the tame category. And then also quite a few other different land cover categories there as well. The other product that we also rely on is the AAFC, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada land cover product circa 2010. This is also at 30-meter resolution, so a little bit more updated, and included 15 land cover classes. And you can see here it identifies grassland / native grassland sort of together. The other product that's available is a yearly product from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. This is also at a 30-meter resolution, but it's produced annually, which is great. It identifies 40 land cover classes, and the strength of this product really seems to be in identifying different crop types. So whether or not you're looking at a soy field or a wheat field or a canola field, that really seems to be one of the strengths of this particular product. But because of those varying products and varying ways in which people identify native grassland and typically the inability in a lot of those products to accurately distinguish native and tame grasslands. At least when we look at Saskatchewan, the estimates of amount of native grassland remaining in Saskatchewan are varied. It, ranges anywhere from about 18% to 29%, depending on what land cover product you use, how confident you are in it being able to distinguish native and tame, and also what you're calling native and tame. And at least from a provincial perspective, the question is always, well, why is figuring out what is native and what is tame so important? And at least from a provincial perspective, native grassland is a high priority habitat to avoid. And, this incorporates issues and informs issues like pre-development industrial planning. Again, from a non-government and government management perspective, those remaining native grassland areas are likely important biodiversity areas. And we do know also that from a narrow species perspective, that some species prefer native grasslands over tame. So think of something like Sprague's pipit that's tends to be way more abundant in native grasslands compared to tame. And so if we really want to identify things like critical habitat and identify habitat for these species, being able to distinguish these two habitat types is really important. And I guess one thing I should back up a little bit. What we're sort of identifying as native, or what is typically thought, is unbroken or has never been grassland that has never been broken in the past, whereas tame grasslands have been broken and then replanted with exotic grass and forb species. So in order to answer these few questions, we established a study area in southwestern Saskatchewan, and folks on the call may recognize the boundaries of this study area. This is the Battle Creek Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada community pasture. So we had gone down in this area to do a small pilot assessment of using some techniques to identify native and tame. And the really good part about this study area is that within the study area, there were really only those two land cover types within those boundaries. And just to give folks a little bit of an idea, climate each summer temperature is about 16 degrees, relatively dry in that area. Peak rainfall season is June. Within that area, there actually wasn't any hay cropping. It was all used for domestic cattle grazing. There was annual cropland around the study area and some hay cropping as well around the study area. Just in terms of some on-the-ground information, in this area, the native grass species were things like June grass, northern wheatgrass, needle and thread grass, and blue grama, interspersed with various native forbs and small shrubs. The tame grasslands in that area were primarily crested wheatgrass, Russian wild rye, and alfalfa. And some fields with a mix of those different species as well. So in order to look at sort of the techniques that we used and understand how well they were performing, we had to do some ground validation or ground truthing, quote unquote. So we established about 147 points within that Battle Creek pasture. 82 of them were native grassland and 65 were tame, so a fairly good split. We established 10 meter by 10 meter plots and assessed the coverage of different plant types within those 10 meter by 10 meter plots. Now, we had to make a bit of a call in our modeling procedure. And so what we're calling native from now on is plots that have greater than 50% cover of native grasses, forbs, and shrubs. and what we've called tame grasslands are grasslands with greater than 50% cover of tame grasses or forbs. So there was a bit of a call that needed to be made in terms of what do we actually call native and what do we call tame. We're working on refining that a little bit at the moment, but for this pilot study, we kind of had a yes, no, is it native, is it tame? And so we used, or we wanted to assess 3 methods to understand what was native and what was tame in this area. And I'll talk about each one of these separately, but we used some satellite image information based on the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI for short. We also used something called LiDAR. And then we also contracted out some folks to do some heads-up digitizing. And like I said, I'll cover each one of those in the next few slides. So for a remote sensing method, we used recent 30-meter Landsat cloud-free imagery, and Landsat is freely available satellite imagery, so it was a good choice or a good product for us to have access to. There's some other products out there, for those of you that are familiar, that are a bit coarser resolution at 250 meter squares instead of 30 meter, and it just seemed like for our study area at least, we lost a little bit, we lost too much using that coarser resolution information. And like I said, we used a product from that satellite imagery that measures vegetation productivity in an area. It's called NDVI. A nice little graphic on the right-hand side here. So a higher NDVI value simply means greener and more productive vegetation, and a lower NDVI value indicates either stressed vegetation or vegetation that's not quite as productive as other areas. And what we thought, based on some previous work that had gone on in the Suffield, CFB Suffield, there had been some work on distinguishing native and tame, and then also a recent study down in the US by Sarah Olim that was looking at distinguishing native and tame. And what we thought when we started is that native grassland should likely green up earlier in the year compared to native, and change differently over time, and we'd be able to pick that up with the satellite imagery. And I'm not going to spend too much time, but we did use scenes from 2005, but we know from Ag Canada at least that there hadn't been any habitat changes in that study area since then, so we were pretty comfortable using that information. We used a series of images from April 1st to August 6th to understand changes in the vegetation productivity over time. We did have some issues with clouds as well that were included in the statistical modeling. And then we also had a pretty, for lack of a better word, undulating and rough terrain in this area. Lots of valleys and small waterways. And so those valleys and small waterways typically aren't or hadn't been converted in the past. So we included information on the sort of slope position in our modeling technique. I'm just going to quickly skip over this, but we split our data up just to see how well it predicted, or the results predicted an independent data set. But in the end, what we ended up with was a model that included information from vegetation productivity over a few days during the growing season, as well as information on the slope position of where the pixel was located. But just to give folks a little bit of an idea, this is a snapshot day 170. That's sort of in the mid-June period. The darker gray areas in here, and all in here, are what we identified as native dominant grasslands, and the lighter gray that you get tend to slip into the more tame dominated grasslands. So even with an image from one day, we were able to to distinguish those two habitat types fairly well. So that was promising, in that our first method seemed to work pretty well. And I'll show you some of the results from each of these methods later on in the talk. But you can see all of the valley bottoms and small waterways coursing throughout this study area. And so the other product that we had access to is called LiDAR. It's light detection and ranging. And essentially what you do is you fly over an area, and for those of you who have ever used rangefinders for hunting or golfing or whatever, it's a very similar concept. You fly a plane over an area and you bounce laser beams off the ground. Some of those laser beams will hit the ground underneath vegetation, and some will hit vegetation on top of the ground. And you get two products from that LiDAR information. First product you get is simply changes in elevation. So think about if you're all sitting at your desk in your office right now, it would be a flat surface representing the floor. And then the other product that you get from LiDAR is called a digital surface model, and that represents all of the stuff on top of the floor. So if we flew a LiDAR over your desk, it would show your desk, any chairs in your office, your computer, your telephone, and all of that fun stuff. So when we initially did this, we kind of thought that we'd be able to distinguish the native and tame grasslands simply based on vegetation height. At least in this area, the crested wheat and the alfalfa tends to be a little bit taller and denser than the vegetation in the native grasslands. And so when we first started, we thought, geez, this would be a great way to be able to map vegetation height in these different areas. But we actually started looking at that product, and it really didn't help us out a lot. But it was sort of interestingly and happenstance, we were looking at a different product that's produced by the LiDAR information, and this sort of gives you a different view of changes in the ground height across the study area. And just to give folks a little bit of an orientation, this trail moving through here is a two-track truck trail. So think of this little area here as about the width of a tire, and this area as well. So that sort of gives you an idea of the resolution that we were working with this area. But what was even more interesting is that we had gone out and done our ground validation, so we knew what was tame. And when we started looking at this product here, and you can see it fairly clearly in this example, you can see these linear features going north-south in this case. And those are remnants from when the field was previously broken. So those are old tractor furrow lines where a field had been, the vegetation had been removed in a formerly native grassland field, and then likely replanted with some species mix. So we thought, geez, we can see this indication of land use history from this product. Can we map it and sort of automatically get a computer to identify and distinguish these areas with these lines in them to the native grassland field, which you can see is a pretty good comparison here. There's no linear features in it, and it's quite heterogeneous. So it's kind of an interesting discovery that we made, just sort of looking through and some of the data products that we received from this. So we used some different techniques in ArcGIS and some of the different LiDAR products to try to bring out those areas with the linear features. And this is what we came up with. So this is that exact same study area, and all of the areas in the darker black and even these lighter gray areas are areas with those tractor furrows in them. And the lighter gray areas are likely completely native or had never been previously broken in the past. But it was a bit shocking when we when we did this analysis of how much of that area actually had tractor furrows present in it that was indicative of having previously been broken in the past. So we went through that process, created that map, and we used a newer technique called e-cognition. And instead of classifying things pixel by pixel, it sort of takes a picture and it groups identical pixels together and then classifies them. So an example down here, this is a bit of sagebrush or shrubs, and your e-cognition program takes that image and then groups the pixels together, and then you can classify them and say, yeah, these really dark ones are shrubs, and this lighter area may be a river, and then the lighter gray areas are a grass-dominated area. So the other product that we started on was a heads-up digitizing product, and we contracted an individual from Saskatchewan Research Council to do this, and essentially what they did was they used a product that we have called FlySask, and looked on a computer at the imagery and then traced out polygons and assigned Landcover classes to them. So it was entirely human driven process. And before we started this project, we had actually done some fairly heavy consultations with folks from Alberta and how they went about doing their grassland vegetation inventory product, which is another Landcover product that's available in Alberta. And from a Saskatchewan perspective, we were really interested in sort of a seamless product between the two provinces. And so we wanted to understand whether or not we A, could do that, and B, how much money it might cost us to make a Saskatchewan-wide product that was equivalent to the product that's available in Alberta. But when we quickly realized that when we started, the scope and the information that's available in Alberta's Grassland Vegetation Inventory was a little bit beyond what we could likely accomplish given the budget that we had to work with. So we went in and had the person hand digitize things like cover type, some site-related modifiers. We had access to 3D imagery, so they could identify things like shrub cover and height in a polygon, as well as tree cover and height, and things like bare soil and wetlands and water. So it was a bit of a scaled down version of Alberta, but kind of using the backbone or the skeleton of the Alberta GVI. And this is what a map like that looks like. This is one of the areas in that Battle Creek pasture, and you can see you do get a little bit more information from than some of the results where we're just mapping native and tame, but you can see here the orange areas are classified as tame, yellow areas are classified as native, and then you do get some information on wetlands, water bodies. I think there's some also residences, rural residences in there as well. So you get a little bit more of a detailed map and different land cover types from this procedure. So moving on to some of the results here. This is what our final map with the remote sensing looked like. This was using that vegetation productivity and identified the areas in orange as tame and the areas in green as native. And the triangles in the back are simply our ground validated data. So we had pretty good agreement with the remote sensing method. The LiDAR method identified quite a few additional areas as likely being dominated by tame grasses, and the exact same color scheme here. And then lastly, we actually ran out of money sort of halfway through for the contractor, so we only got part of the study area done, but this area in the bottom gives you a fairly good comparison of the different identified land covers from the heads-up digitizing exercise. So how good did we do? And that's always the big question that everyone has. Is this going to get us to a point above where we currently are in identifying these two habitat types? So the remote sensing method, we actually did pretty well. 88% of our ground truthed plots were correctly identified as native, and 87% of our ground truth tame plots were correctly identified as tame. So that was looking really good. The LiDAR method, it performed really well in correctly identifying tame grasslands, but not so well in identifying native. And what we think is going on here is when we had done the ground validation exercise, we identified a few plots that were dominated by native grass, a little bit of bare ground. It had a bit of a biological crust on it, but still some remnants of crested wheat plants. And so what we think is happening in this case, when we reviewed those ground truth points, it was fairly clear that they all had tractor furrows in them. But what we think is happening is that some of those plots are actually starting to revert back to native dominant species mix, which was kind of interesting. We don't know, or we didn't know a lot about the land use history in this area, but it's likely that a lot of those fields had been broken, 70, 80 years ago. So it is interesting that we are starting to get some of those fields starting to revert back to a native dominant species mix, even though we had evidence that they were previously broken in the past. So kind of an interesting result there. And we are actually seeing that same trend in some other areas where we're doing pilot projects. The heads-up digitizing also did fairly well, sort of 82% of our tame points were correctly identified and 91% of our tame points were correctly identified. And so that sort of gives a good comparison between the three methods that we implemented, but we also wanted to look at what does the current sort of best available layer tell us. And sort of not surprisingly, it does very well at identifying tame and not so well at identifying, or it does very well at identifying native, but not so well at identifying tame. And this is pretty understandable when you look at that product. At least in that Battle Creek pasture, it's identifying almost everything as native grassland. So you can see that, at least we have to use a little bit of a caution when we're using some of these nationwide data sets when we're thinking about where unbroken native grassland is still remaining in the various provinces. I thought it'd be useful to give folks a little bit of a cost and time analysis of some of the work that we've done. So in terms of the NDVI, the imagery acquisition was zero, just the time spent downloading the information. It was about a 1 to 2 week process for us to process the imagery into usable information, and then the modeling and the digitizing actually didn't take very long once we had all of those products ready to go. The LiDAR is a fairly extensive new technology. The imagery acquisition was about $50,000 for that 219 square kilometer area, but that included all of the data processing done by a company that we contracted out. In terms of the field work, it's about 3 days of flight time and about 5 weeks for the company to process the data. And actually the modeling side, once we had that information, didn't take very long at all. It took us about 1 to 2 days to classify that entire area. Heads up digitizing, the imagery acquisition, we used FlySask, so that was sort of a back-end cost, I guess. There wasn't any actual on-the-ground work that needed to be done. But for that 219 square kilometer area, it took between 28 to 60 hours to digitize that. And that range is provided because we did one product with a reduced number of attributes, and another product that really tried to mimic what was done in the Alberta Grassland Vegetation Inventory. So, pretty time intensive for that particular method. So just to recap and give you a little bit of an idea where we're going, LiDAR is really expensive, and so at least from a Saskatchewan perspective, it's likely not feasible province-wide. And there were some cautions associated with using that method. It could not identify areas that were invaded by tame species. So where you have a native grassland where things like crested wheat and smooth brome are starting to invade, because there's not that underlying indication of tractor furrows, this technique wouldn't identify those. And also, as I mentioned, it's seems to be lacking a little bit in those fields that are starting to revert back to native, even though they were previously broken. And we're a little bit unsure what resolution is needed to identify those tractor furrows. We arguably had a really high resolution product, and so whether or not you could get away with something lower resolution still remains to be determined. But it is kind of an interesting technique that can give us a really good idea of previous or historical land use in an area. And we've actually been chatting with some folks from South Dakota State that have LiDAR across their entire state, and they're using this technique to map or spatially map previous land use history. So it seems to be a fruitful possibility going forward, depending on whether or not you have access to LiDAR and really what your goal is. Heads-up digitizing was really just too darn time-consuming and expensive, and relies on a pretty good small army of experienced digitizers. The amount of detail in some of those attributes was exhaustive, but most users really rely on that Landcover information only. So we're likely stepping away from both of those methods, but it was a good pilot study to really get a handle on how well some of these things work. So in terms of our next steps, and we're sort of thinking in a 5-year plan, we decided that the remote sensing method is likely our only way forward. We're looking at some new imagery that's a little bit higher resolution, so it divides the province into 10 meter squares instead of 30. And we're looking at some different classification techniques, but it's really going to be a long-term process, because we do think that the techniques that we used, for example, in the Southwest, will likely be different in the East because of things like different precipitation regimes, different temperature regimes, different species composition mixes. So we're really wanting to expand this one pilot study area to a few other areas across Saskatchewan. And one of those areas was, this is some new information that we've just been working on, down near the Weyburn area, so southeastern Saskatchewan. We had done some ground truthing or ground validation this last summer in the former Wellington Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada pasture. And this is our classification on the left here, and yellow is cropland, green is native dominant, and then the red is tame grasslands. And we did have some access. We did have access to previous Ag Canada mapping for that pasture, and it does seem to be performing fairly well. Other than this area in here, we seem to be missing some of the tame areas. Should say the highlighted areas in here had been planted with crested wheat, and then the areas without color were native species. So you look at this area here, we've captured that pretty well. This A4 as well, we get pretty good indication. This little area right here is represented over here, and we're able to pick that out. So still a little bit of a work in progress, but we're quite excited about how well the technique seems to be working in different areas of the province. We did develop a new, I'll wrap up here pretty soon. We did develop a new phone app using a program called Survey 123, and this is mostly being used for internal ministry. We're trying to get it out to some of our folks in the Ministry of Agriculture, but also our own fish and wildlife staff that are on the ground. We've also sent it out to some partners in Saskatchewan like NCC and Nature Saskatchewan. And it's really meant to be a quick and dirty assessment of vegetation cover in areas. We're really concentrating on things that are fairly clearly dominated by native or tame vegetation, and it does tend to be skewed, or the data that we get back is tends to be skewed to easily identifiable things like alfalfa hayfields and things like that. But it does allow us to collect opportunistically fairly meaningful data that we can use in some of the modeling and assessment work that we're doing. So it's a good thing moving forward, and we're kind of pleased to see that out and collecting data from individuals, not just in fish, wildlife, and lands branch here. So just to quickly summarize, all of our methods significantly increased our ability to distinguish native and tame grasslands compared to the currently available land cover layers. That technique that I described using the LiDAR information was fairly new, and was actually just published in a journal called Remote Sensing of Environment, so we're kind of pleased with that. It did provide some confirmation that some existing techniques, like I said, that were tried out in CFB Suffield and down in the US has some application up here in Saskatchewan. With that, I'm pleased to answer any questions that you might have.
Everyone, if you could please type your questions into the chat box, we'll get Ryan, have Ryan answer them.
I noticed Phil had a question there in the chat. Was classification better for those sites shown to be very dominant tame or native by ground truthing? Yeah, so it did tend to pick up the sites that were maybe more on the 75 or greater percent, especially for the remote sensing imagery. But that last little bit of information that I presented down in the southeast, we were actually dealing with a lot of fields that were in that sort of half and half to 60-40, 70-30 splits, and we seem to be able to pick that up fairly well. And I think moving forward, once we kind of refine some of the techniques a little bit, we should be able to get that a little bit better. But yeah, definitely we were picking up the more dominant field types with the one technique.
Looks like we still have another question coming in.
Yeah, that's a good question, Phil. In terms of thresholds for native coverage needed for some of those species. It's really interesting, at least for a lot of the bird work that I'm aware of. So some of the work that Environment Canada is doing and some of the work that I was involved with in a previous life. A lot of those studies have done very similar things to what we did. They've called a field native based on certain criteria and called a field tame based on certain criteria. And whether that's 60-40 or 50-50, it's not typically known. So yeah, that's kind of a interesting phase for future study. I think too, for a lot of those species that the two vegetation, the native and tame classes, are really reflective of vegetation structure, and that's what the bird species are queuing in on. You know, it's the tame fields tend to be taller and more dense compared to the native, and it's likely that the birds are queuing in on the density information. So so I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Okay.
Hey Tony, yeah, it's an interesting problem. I think we're struggling a little bit with how to take the smaller scale information and operationalize it to the quote unquote agricultural region of Saskatchewan. But you know, I do understand that Manitoba does have a almost province-wide LiDAR product, and so that may be a good start to at least get that information or separation of previous land use history in the province. If you can use that product to identify previous plow print, that would give you a heck of a good head start. You know, we are finding that getting a good feel for how these techniques vary from east to west, and admittedly we haven't done a lot of stuff further north, sort of north of #1 highway in Saskatchewan, and so it'll be interesting to understand how things change a little bit and how much easier or more difficult it might be going forward. So we've been really focusing on pilot areas in different parts of the province, and that seems to be really helping, giving us a better idea of future costs and potential for doing this across the province. And yeah, more than willing to chat, you know, offline if folks have questions about what we're up to. Yeah, I should also mention too, we did do, like I said, folks before me did a lot of consultation and had a lot of good input from the folks in Alberta that did the Grassland Vegetation Inventory, and so that was a really good jumping off point for us to you know, identify some methods that we could use that were maybe a little more cost efficient going forward. So had some really good help from Alberta folks as well, who had a lot of experience doing this.
All right. If there are no other questions, thank you, Ryan, and everybody for attending today's presentation. Oh, looks like we have another one coming in.
Well, thanks very much for everyone tuning in today. And yeah, if folks have any questions, my email is on this last slide here. It's ryan.fisher@gov.sk.ca, and more than happy to chat about what we're up to here.
Okay. Thank you. Again, thank you, Ryan, and thank you everybody for attending today's presentation. I hope everybody has a happy holiday season, and we'll see you again for our next PHJV webinar in the new year. Thank you, everyone.